My name is Nicole Shumway. I am a postdoc in RRAP, taking sort of a sidestep from the engagement subprogram. I'm actually in the regulatory subprogram, myself and colleagues. And today I'm going to talk to you about the work that we're doing building resilient and adaptive policy in the Great Barrier Reef. There we go. There. And I'm at the University of Queensland in the Centre for Policy Futures. All right, so everybody's seen this map. This is what traditional marine conservation looks like, right? It is a map of protected areas in Australia. It was designed to prohibit and protect, right? That was the main obligation. But as we're finding, there's a rise, and it's great to see more active interventions happening in this space, not just in the Great Barrier Reef, but all around Australia, in oyster restoration, in coral restoration, mangroves, adaptation, nature-based solutions. All of these things are starting to rise, right? And that's great. The problem is that the policy was designed to protect and prohibit. It was not designed to allow active interventions. So while it's great that we have this huge upwelling of conservation activities happening, what it means in practice is that the policies, and by policy, I mean like the legislation, just the broad policy frameworks in place, they don't support active intervention. So they have to go through the same regulatory framework as something like an impact development. So through the development approvals process. And that ultimately really means that they're complex, they involve lots of different departments, and it really limits the amount of restoration and adaptation that can occur. Add RRAP on top of it. And what this means, you add in emerging technologies and it leads to even more complex policy challenges. Things around uncertainty, especially around novel impacts, right? Missing framework. So some of the things, and not just in Australia and in the Great Barrier Reef, but globally that are being proposed for coral reefs are not in any way regulated. Like it's very much a gray space. So there are missing frameworks. There's a pacing problem. The technology is advancing faster than the policy can keep up, right? And there's this argument that we've sort of been talking about here around safeguards versus innovation, right? So that comes out in a lot of the engagement framing that people are talking about, like how to safeguard the reef from unnecessary impacts, while also allowing innovation to build resilience. So all of these policy challenges are sort of coming together in the RRAP project. So it makes it really interesting, but also very complex and very challenging. So in the regulatory subprogram, what we wanted to know is, first, I guess, how are restoration and adaptation regulated currently in the Great Barrier Reef? How is it regulated throughout Australia? How are other countries doing it? Just because we're the first in Australia doesn't mean that we're the first, right? How are other areas doing it? So we looked at emerging technologies, nanotechnologies, genetic modification. What are the sort of policy frameworks that they're using that maybe we can adapt some of these policies and principles to fit into a restoration and conservation context? I'll run through this really quickly. The main thing I want you to take away from this is that most of these policy frameworks were established or published in the last couple of years. And most of them are not around conservation or restoration. Most of them are in the emerging technology space. So this is just one example that we picked up. It is a framework from the emerging technology space. It's called anticipatory regulation. It's got all these lovely values that are important to incorporate into policy and governance frameworks. So right now, there is a window of opportunity, right, to develop robust and resilient policy in advance of the onset of some of these interventions that are happening. I couldn't remember the word you used. But our goal in the regulatory subprogram is to facilitate informed decision makers with the regulators in order to empower them to understand and evaluate the evolving risks and uncertainties around the interventions that are happening. I'll just quickly run through this. So experimental, this is a big one. Innovation testing at a local scale, particularly where regulation is missing or where there's mismatched regulation, is important. I'm not going to talk about inclusive and collaborative because you've all done a wonderful job of that for me, but I am going to quickly talk about future-facing and proactive. So understanding potential futures is key to developing robust regulation, right? Particularly in the face of climate change. We don't know what the future's going to look like because that really depends on how we act now, the decisions that we make now. And so the GBRMPA's reef intervention policy is a great example of them doing this in advance of some of the things that are coming forward. So a lot of this is already happening in the context of the GBR, but also RRAP is precipitating the need for these changes. And I could talk way more about this framework, but basically there's more work that's needed to bridge the gap between where policy is now and where it needs to be to really be anticipatory and not just, reflexive, I guess. Yep, perfect. And that's me. And thanks to all my collaborators and all the GBR regulators that, came together for this.